Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this, the sixth meeting of the Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee for 2025. I've received apologies this morning from Ruth Maguire, so I'd like to welcome Rona Mackay this morning as substitute. And our first agenda item is a declaration of interest from a new member. And can I welcome Emma Roddick, MSP, to the committee, and would invite her to declare if there are any interests relevant to the role on this committee. Good morning, Emma.
Thank you. Good morning, Convener. Very excited to be here, and relevant on my interests is that I was a Highland Councillor until May 2022.
Excellent, and can I welcome you very much to the committee. I'd also like to seek the agreement of the committee to write and thank Joe Fitzpatrick, MSP, for his contribution to the committee over the period of his tenure. Hope we're happy with that. Our second agenda item is a decision on taking business in private. That is items 4 and 5 on our agenda. Item 4 will be a discussion about the evidence that hopefully we are about to hear. And item 5 is consideration of guidance on chamber business. Are the committee happy to take that in private? Excellent, I'm grateful. And that brings us to agenda item 3 and our committee effectiveness inquiry. Today is the third in a series of 4 oral evidence sessions on our committee effectiveness inquiry. The inquiry is seeking to answer the question, are there changes to the Parliament's procedures and practices which would help committees to work more effectively? Our call for written views on the inquiry has now closed, and the submissions will be published on our website in due course. Today, we are seeking to explore committee effectiveness in the context of the changes to the committee system in other legislatures and how these have been measured and indeed evaluated. And I am very welcome to for today to give welcome to Professor Diana Sturbu, Co-Director of the Centre for Applied Research and Empowering Society from the London Metropolitan University, who joins us online. Good morning, Professor. To Professor Philip Lord Norton of Louth, Professor of Government and Director of the Centre for Legislative Studies at the University of Hull. Good morning. To Dr. Stephen Holden Bates, Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the University of Birmingham. Good morning. And to Dr. Ruth Fox, who is Director and Head of the Research of the Hansard Society. Good morning, Ruth. Good morning. It's a roundtable evidence session, and whilst the usual approach to questions from members to witnesses, it is intended there's also an opportunity to create a discussion between witnesses on points and to encourage a more open and free dialogue. There is no expectation that witnesses will answer all of the questions. Should anyone wish to come in on a question or in response to a point made by another witness, please indicate by catching the eye of either myself or the clerks. And for Professor Sturbu appearing remotely, again, if you could place R in the chat or pop your hand up and I will notice, I'd be most grateful. As tends to be the case, you're going to be thrown at the mercy of the convener for the first set of questions. So what I would like to look at is really that definition or the meaning of the word effectiveness of committees. Is effectiveness context specific? And if so, what are the factors that shape whether committees are effective in the places that witnesses yourselves have worked and observed? So what is effectiveness in committees? Would anyone like to kick off? Stephen, would come to you first.
I mean, yeah, I can say a few things. I mean, effectiveness has to be defined partly because of, in terms of the audience. So committees have got different audiences, and how you might be effective in regard to one group of people may be different from another. So, you know, you're engaging with the electorate, you're engaging with Parliament, you're engaging with government, you're engaging with stakeholders of one kind or another, and different parts of committees' work are going to be directed differently to those audiences. So. Just to give you one example from a little piece of work that we did, we looked at the number of times committee reports were tagged in Westminster debates of one kind or another. And on that measure, both in terms of the percentages of reports that were tagged and the number they were tagged at least once, the Defence Committee came out top in that regard. So it was very good at informing the House. One of the jobs of House of Commons Select Committees is informing the House, and the Defence Committee did very well in that regard. Bottom of the pile was the culture, media and sports committee, they didn't get a high percentage of reports, or they got, in fact, a very low percentage of reports tagged in debates in the House. But they've got kind of, unofficially, you could argue that they've got different audiences. So the Defence Committee is very inward-looking, like a police patrol, looking at what government does, regularly looking at the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and it does it on a kind of regular, kind of like clockwork business. Whereas the Culture, Media and Sports Committee often responds to things that are going out there in society that are important to the public. So the effectiveness for engaging the public, responding to public concerns, is different from effectiveness in terms of informing the House, making sure that other MPs are up to date with and on top of the work that the Defence Committee are doing. So I think you need to define effectiveness both in terms of the audience and what part of the job committees are doing.
Do you think there's a balance then in the effectiveness between, in essence, in the broadest terms, who the committee is speaking to, and as you say, that's different audiences depending on what they do, but do you think committees have a responsibility to be seen as effective as possible to the most audiences, and if not, which takes priority?
Well, I mean, that's the like, million-dollar question, isn't it? Can a committee be effective in engaging with all audiences all of the time? Like, I would imagine the answer to that is no, and what the concerns of the committee are going to be driven in part by what policy area or what concerns it has. So obviously there are certain committees that are going to be more outward-looking by their very nature, and there are other ones which are perhaps going to be more concerned with the operation of government and the scrutiny of government.
Any other comments? Philip, yeah.
To reinforce that, I mean, each legislature, each committee, you've got two audiences. So, if you like, you've outward-facing to the executive, outward-facing to the public. Obviously, there's a relationship between the tasks you fulfil, but how they're evaluated. In terms of evaluating it, I think you have to take a nuanced approach, because if you're looking at how you deal with the executive, normally that's in relation to legislation, public policy. To some extent, that's measurable. A bill comes in, does it go out exactly as it came in? Has the legislature made a difference? With policy, you could do it in terms of how many recommendations emanating from a committee are accepted by government. But so you can do it quantitatively, you've got some measure, but I think it's got to be nuanced, because it's not always quite that simple. For two reasons. One is what in Westminster is known as the delayed drop effect. So a committee makes a recommendation, the executive says, no, that's rubbish, we're not doing it. 2 or 3 years down the line, strangely enough, it gets carried out. A new minister comes in, dusts off the report, and thinks, that's quite good. So, but they're not necessarily going to credit the committee, so you can't actually prove a causal relationship. And the other element I think you need to bear in mind is that sometimes your work, your reports can influence thinking. It informs the debate, but not necessarily in a hard, measurable way. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. Reports can be very important for shaping debate, influencing how people see an issue. So I think one needs to bear that in mind. But I say you cannot do some degree of measurement. More difficult with how the public view the legislature, because what you might be trying to achieve may be viewed differently. And there is a problem, I'm afraid, in terms of how public view legislature, not least in whether they think members are doing a good job and whether they trust the legislature, because quite often that's actually determined by variables independent of the legislature. Quite often it's dependent on how they view the political system as a whole, whether it's delivering what the government's doing, and in a way the legislature derives from that rather than what it's doing in its own right. So I just put those. You can be doing a good job, which may not always be appreciated by people outside if public policy isn't having the effect they expect it to have.
A number of... sorry, Ruth, did you want to... Or
I would just add to that, perhaps, a way of looking at and thinking about it is that you've almost got to have, as a committee, a short, a medium and a long-term lens to look at your work and your effectiveness. And the sort of the committee system as a whole within a parliament may have strategic priorities and objectives, and that has to be assessed across all the committees. But then the committee itself may have its own strategic priorities at the start of a parliament. And then each individual inquiry may have its, or should have its own sort of priorities and objectives. And they may have different audiences and different types of objectives and therefore evaluation measures that you want to apply. And we can get very, very focused on, oh, the committee is not as effective as it could be, or we're not having the impact that we want. But actually, for the reasons that Philip's articulated, sometimes you are. It's just that you don't necessarily see it in the timescale through which you're looking at it. And that, in part, links to one of the issues around effectiveness about turnover of members of a committee and the ability to have a long view and to sort of be able to track the effectiveness of a committee beyond, well, in Commons terms, a session or a parliament.
Just before I come to Diana, Ruth, do you think there should be a very specific onus on committees then to identify those expected successes or what the measure of success should look like, both in the sort of short, specific inquiry, medium and long term early on? Would that?
I think so, yes, because one of the big challenges for committees in any parliament, no matter the size, the capacity, the resources they have, is they always complain about the lack of time, and there's so much we'd like to do but don't have time to do. So you have to be ruthlessly prioritised to be effective. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to publish those priorities. I mean, you may summarise them for public consumption, but you may want, for the sort of purposes of the internal dynamics of a committee and its work and planning its work, to have a sort of an internal document that helps you choose, helps you evaluate the work that you do. But I do think that's helpful, because otherwise you're sort of operating on a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah. Diana, can I come to you? And good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to appear virtually. I want to agree with everything that has been said about the importance of having a very nuanced approach to how we look at effectiveness, the importance of audiences and of strategic planning. I would go back to your first question in terms of whether a definition of effectiveness is context specific, and I think to some extent it is, because I suppose in the simplest terms, effectiveness is the extent to which the goals that you have set at the beginning of a process have been achieved. So in this context, depending on the goals that each committee is setting, then effectiveness will be a little bit different. If we take a functionalist approach, and most parliaments will have a set of core sort of functions, and committee systems would have a set of core tasks or roles that they need to fulfill, then that is again another criteria against which we can evaluate whether committees are effective or not. But I wanted to turn back to something that Ruth said in terms of the importance of setting those goals at the beginning of either an inquiry or a beginning of a term. And I think, basing now on the research that I have done in the Welsh Parliament a couple of years ago, that process is actually in the Senate is quite well defined. There's external facilitators that are coming and supporting members with prioritizing, with setting goals and facilitating these strategy days that eventually lead to a forward working program for the committees. So I think that's a very important piece of work that is happening. But I agree with what Ruth is saying, that we also need to, rather than having just a simple forward-working program, to actually set goals, short-term, medium-term, and long-term for the committee. And the program of activities should derive from those set of goals. My last point on this is that the default position, I think, when we talk about effectiveness in committees, is to look at the relationship between the committee and the government, and whether committee reports have been implemented, whether legislation and amendments in committees have been accepted, and so on and so forth. From my work with the Senate, where I interviewed, I think it was all the committee chairs at the time, I asked about the aspirations and the goals, and what they see as an effective committee, and I wasn't that surprised to notice actually that apart from this relationship between government and the committee, there's a series of other high-level goals and aspirations that committee chairs held for their committees. Things like diversity, so engaging the wide range of individuals and organizations in the deliberations of the committee. Goals such as learning as a committee, but also facilitating learning with the government, especially in terms of legislative drafting and so on and so forth. There's goals about democracy and legitimacy. There's higher level goals around visibility and public profile. So I think these are things that are notoriously hard to measure, but I think that nevertheless they are quite important in bringing in the discussion around effectiveness, because these are also seen as very important for members, and particularly for committee chairs.
Thank you, Diana. Sorry, Philip, did you want to?
One point to bear in mind is if you're talking about goals and then you evaluate whether they're achieved, you take a step back, because there's a fundamental question of who decides the goals. So is it the committee deciding for itself? Is it the legislature imposing certain goals? How do the public view a committee? Because their expectation, what they think a committee may be doing, what it's about, how they evaluate it, may be very different from how the committee itself sees its role. So I think you'd need to take all that into account.
And that's interesting, because my next question is going to come on to the sort of statement of purpose, which I know exists both at Westminster, but is probably even more developed at the Senate. And what is the role of that statement, and is it a parliament-wide statement, or should we consider perhaps even committee-level statements as to the statement of purpose? I don't know. Can I come to you first, Anna? Because I know there's a lot of work being done at the Senate in relation to that. Do you have a view? And how do you develop one, I suppose, is the other.
I think that statement of purpose is important because it does link with the idea of strategic planning and being strategic in a sense. And I suppose at the Senate, that particular statement of purpose, if you want, which they call I think the criteria for world-class committee, came out of a review of committee support. And we also need to bear in mind the context in which that concept of world-class committees evolved in the Senate. It's a very small institution. Committees are very small, sometimes 4 members, up to 6 or 8 members. And committee support is very, very important in achieving those that ambition of having world-class committees. But it does set a framework against which committee chairs and committees as a whole work and try to embed that culture of collegial and collaborative working, leaving the politics, the party politics aside, and trying to conduct inquiries or to fulfill their tasks in an independent and authoritative way. My interviews with committee chairs and with staff at the time emphasized the importance of being clear about what committees are for, about being clear even within a session and even within a particular inquiry, just as Ruth mentioned earlier, about what is it that we're trying to achieve, even at the very kind of inquiry level, because there are some situations where a committee might actually just want to put pressure on the government, or there might be inquiries, for instance, where the committee just wants to hear broader evidence, or they might want to just cast a spotlight on an issue that is not necessarily on the government radar, and depending on that statement of purpose, either at the inquiry level or at the sort of committee system level, that is very important. That particular work has been endorsed by the Chairs Forum. And I think that structure within the Senate is actually quite important in fostering, I suppose, a shared view of what committees are, what their purpose is, and what effective chairing and effective committees mean.
And there's also, within the Senate, there's also a very explicit expectation that both the government will work with the committees, but also that the committees will work with the government. Do you think, setting that bar of expectation has been of assistance in achieving effectiveness?
I think so. I also think that is still, maybe one of the, there's a discussion there to have whether that particular expectation is actually a legacy of the corporate body culture and the original setup of the Senate, of the Assembly at the time. I know that us as academics and we criticised very much that particular model at the time, with the ministers sitting as members of committees. But the fact is that actually, by the nature of the ministers sitting in committees, the committees had access to a lot of, government information and so on and so forth. And I think the discussions that I was privy to back in 2006, 2007, when I was doing my PhD, and monitoring that process, that formal end of the corporate body, there were discussions about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So whether having that separation is going to substantially change the relationship between committees and the government. But I think there's still a little bit of a legacy of that, and it might also be a legacy of the sort of political arithmetic in the Senate, the fact that it's a very small institutions, the fact that committee chairs move on to being ministers, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Daniel, Philip, do you want to come in, or Stephen? I suppose, in respect of that sort of statement of intent and whether or not it should sit at parliamentary level, or whether committees should consider having their own, or whether indeed, I think, as Diana was suggesting, that sort of statement can help attune the ideas for an inquiry to then guide to what success or effectiveness would look like.
What's tended to be what's happened in Westminster, you've got, if you like, an external statement of what's expected of the committees. So when, for example, the departmental select committees were established in the House of Commons, by standing orders, they were set up to examine the expenditure, administration and policy of relevant government departments and associated public bodies. But then the committees, in practice, focused heavily on policy. The liaison committee is now established sort of key task, but again, committees will tend to focus on particular tasks that interest them, so others get somewhat neglected. So it's a bit of a balance between the two. There's a broad framework, but then there's some discretion for the committees to focus on what they think is important.
Signposting rather than requirement.
Exactly.
Ruth?
Yeah, just on that, I mean, the idea of a statement at the sort of the collective parliamentary level is fine, but it's inevitably going to be quite broad brush and quite anodyne. At a committee level where you can become more granular, one of the issues in the House of Commons has always been, you have this 10, I think it may even be now 12 core tasks for select committees. some of which are legislative, sort of pre-post legislative scrutiny, scrutiny of statutory instruments, scrutiny of estimates, and some of which is sort of policy related. There's also a public engagement core task and so on. The challenge for Commons committees has always been, do you use this as a guide to planning your work, or do you use it at the end of your inquiries and the end of your committees as a sort of checklist, tick box, to just say, well, we did 6 of those core tasks over the course of the life of this Parliament. And inevitably it will be different for each individual committee, because they're free to determine their workload. To some extent, for some committees, their workload will be determined for them if there happens to be particular legislation, a bill in draft, or a particular statutory instrument that they may want to look at, very rarely. Some of them want a celebrity witness because they want to get on the news. Some of the committee inquiries will be driven because the committee members want an achievement. They want something at the end of their time to be able to say, I delivered this, because otherwise it's all very well me sitting here saying you have to take a long view to impact and effectiveness, but actually if you've trudged through 5 years on a select committee in Parliament and you get to the end and you can't really point too much in terms of way of impact, that's actually quite, from a personal perspective, quite difficult. And therefore, understandably, some committees, many committees, will go for low-hanging fruit. I think I can get that objective, that legislative policy change, that particular piece of influence over a minister, versus that more strategic, future-looking inquiry that actually might, in the long term, be more important, but actually in the short term is not going to deliver any sense of accomplishment and achievement for you as members.
I suppose, interestingly, following on from that timescale point of view, is there any evidence from other legislatures of committees looking beyond their tight timetable of their existence in the seats, looking forward beyond their session into further sessions? Is there any evidence of that sort of long scope thinking that has, firstly, I suppose, come to fruition, or we're still waiting to see, or whether actually that sort of points to a more effective type committee? Obviously here in the Scottish Parliament, as in lots of parliaments, towards the end of a session, we produce a report which we gleefully hand over to those that we don't know that come after us and see what's done of it. Is there any evidence of anything that goes beyond that, about long-term planning, long-term effectiveness, long-term come back and look at something that we did that is effective? Do you want, Stephen? Do you want to...
I mean, I can say just a couple of things on that. So, I mean, again, the Defence Committee, I think, looked at the impact of climate change on warfare and tensions around the world, which obviously is taking a long-term view. Some of the committees more concerned with, I don't know if it was the Science and Technology Committee or EFRA, but look at like antimicrobial resistance, things like that. So there's obviously a long-term view in those kind of topic areas. I mean, just to...
Sorry, Stephen, was that because of the area that we're looking at, climate change in warfare, rather than something a previous committee had highlighted to be looked at? That's what I'm...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I'm just wondering whether there's any committee that have sown the seeds of a future look that has been successful.
Oh, I see. Yeah. So the thing I was going to say about I was going to say about that is the one concern I've got about setting goals, either the short, medium, or long term, is that if there is high turnover, you can end up with a committee completely new who just doesn't care about it, and then that's not going to be effective because there's just not going to be so much buy-in, and all the work is going to be left to the clerks to sort of like put it through. So that's my one concern about that there's got to be some flexibility to respond to not only new things going on in the world, but also new members, new chairs coming in and having different concerns.
So the best laid plans and strategies go afoot depending on who's on the committee.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's just got to be some flexibility built into that to respond to events and to respond to turnover.
Diana, I think you wanted to come in and then...
Yes, I think In terms of your question, if I understand it correctly, I think an example would be, and you've probably heard of the Committee of the Future in the Finnish Parliament, in the Eduskunta, which really operates quite differently from other committees, does not necessarily have a legislation, is not legislation focused, spends most of its time and resources on commissioning work and engaging in kind of future governance, and has a very broad remit. It has become quite a famous committee. It didn't start as such when it was first established. It was established as it was a hobby horse of two parliamentarians at the time, and it was tolerated for a period of time. But actually, it became more and more important, and I suppose a model for other legislatures to deal with kind of future issues. I suppose from the perspective of the Senate, the Senate had to look at the future quite a lot, especially in terms of constitutional reform. So committees such as the Legislation and Constitutional Affairs Committee, but also ad hoc committees that were being set up in terms of electoral reform, and now we have the Future Senate Committee. They all had to kind of deal with and anticipate what is happening in the future, and anticipate changes to the structure and the operation of the Senate. But I think you meant more on the kind of the policy side. But that would be the example that comes to mind.
Thank you. Philip, did you want to comment?
I'm going to come in on the point that, because you can come up, I always remind my students you have to distinguish between what's desirable and what's achievable. And so you can stand back and come up with some grand scheme that, yes, committees should take a long-term view, look to the future, and fulfil this range of tasks. That might be desirable. You then come up against what's achievable in terms of resources, the members, and the politics, by which I mean if members are elected, that's going to influence how they view their role, their outward-facing activity. So if you like, the sort of work for which there would be a reward, possibly a fairly quick reward in terms of visibility or effect. So the contrast here is at Westminster between the two houses. I mean, the Lords, we don't have that, so you don't necessarily need that quick fix. You're not elected. You can just get down and focus on the detail and look at it in some depth, if necessary look at it in some depth as well long term. We have that capacity because we don't need the attention, we don't need to be seen in the same way. So we can address topics that, if you like, quite often fall outside the normal conflict of party debate. They're not particularly high profile, but they're important. So you leave the Commons, the select committees, to deal with more high-profile work where the members are looking for some degree of visibility and have some impact. So that will shape, that's the reality of how the committees operate. So as I say, you need to bear that in mind, the limited resources, and members themselves. You've got to take into account what appeals to the members. What, in a sense, you need to ask the question, what's in it for them?
And on that point, I'm going to pass over to Emma, who's going to, I think, look at the sort of structure and culture in committees. Thank you, Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. I wanted to first ask about when other committee systems have made use of rapporteurs or other services or people to kind of spread that workload out, and in what ways that can contribute to effectiveness without taking away the accountability from committee members.
Does anybody have any?
Ruth, can I start with you?
I mean, I kick off by saying it's not something I'm terribly familiar with because it's not something that the House of Commons uses terribly much. I won't say it's frowned upon, but it's very rare that an individual committee member is tasked to go away and do a piece of work and report back. They're much more likely to have a subcommittee. You occasionally find that. You might get 3 or 4 members to look at a particular aspect of policy or a particular task, or to conduct a short inquiry where the members have a particular interest in it for whatever reason. So I can't really say an awful lot more than that. I mean, there are other mechanisms at Westminster, things like guesting. So that's not a rapporteur model, but it has elements of it in that a member of a committee, or more often the committee chair, will attend an inquiry undertaken by another committee where there is cross-policy, cross-departmental interest, sort of to avoid siloing. Sometimes those committee members will be invited to ask questions, sometimes they'll be more in as an observer role, but they're there to input the expertise and interests of their committee into that particular inquiry, and likewise take away whatever that they've learnt from that and sort of report back to their committees, their own committee. But it's not a formal rapporteur role.
So it was interesting you said there that the expertise of another committee. Do you think there's enough training goes on for members of committees, or is it more about we just hope that if you're there long enough you'll have picked up enough about the policy area to be an expert?
I think it's very different from committee to committee. I mean, you will have somebody on the health committee, for example. You might have a doctor, or in some cases, recently at Westminster, surgeons, for example, nurses. They have a particular expertise, but I think I don't mean that you necessarily, as committee members, have direct, in-depth policy expertise. In a sense, you're not there for that. That's where you bring in the experts, that's where you bring in the advisors, that's where you draw on the research resources. You are there to provide what the rest of us can't, which is in what I would sort of phrase as political nous, and apply that to the policy discussion, and to think about the issues in terms of the democratic lens that you bring to the issues, and that need to think about trade-offs that the rest of us cannot do. We don't have that role and experience.
I think it's a very good question, because I think it's really important. And I think that you could look at it from two perspectives. One's training in the substance of the subject. What's the committee inquiring into? What's the policy area? So if you're not already got a background in the area, I mean, the Lords, with the appointment of members to committees, generally it's members appointed who've got some experience and expertise in that particular area. So you've normally got a committee that's informed on the subject, which helps enormously with evidence taking, because it's people who understand the subject engaging with experts in the field, so they can have a proper informed discourse. It also means if you know the subject, you not only know what questions to ask, you can evaluate the quality of the answers, which I think is the most important thing when you're taking evidence. But the other aspect of training, which is maybe what you were focusing on, is actually the process of questioning witnesses. How do you go about it? Because members join a committee, they're not, I mean, some may be lawyers, so they're used to forensic questioning. Others are not. And so you get members putting questions that are sort of non-questions, they're sort of statements or they're rambling, rather than knowing how to focus on the topic of the inquiry. What are the key questions you need to ask? And as I say, how do you evaluate quickly the answers so you can pursue them with the witnesses? So I think there is an important dimension there. Do you provide members with some bespoke training in membership of committees, provide some guidance? We're doing that in the Lords now, because early this week I was meeting new members to explain how committees operate, how they work, to give them some basis already when they're appointed to committees. But then, as I say, we tend to appoint people who know about the subject. But if it's a committee where the members aren't particularly knowledgeable of the area, what you do is you have seminars, you bring in people from outside, so at least you get some grounding, some basic knowledge about the subject area. So I think it's very important that one should invest resources in that way to maximise the effectiveness of the committees through members knowing how to operate as members and having some grounding in the subject area.
Diana wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose that from the perspective of the Senate, there have been instances where they've used rapporteurs, and I think less instances where they've used subcommittees. Obviously, the context there is the committees are very small. So, to what extent establishing a subcommittee in a committee of 4 is it's not very doable. What I did hear about in my interviews is the use of what they call reference groups that support particular committee inquiries. So the Children and Young People and Education Committee in the 5th Senate was, I think it was, that they've used a reference group of young people to inform particular inquiries, or there have been instances of reference group of people working with let's say, unheard groups or more marginalized groups in order to inform the work of the committee. And it's part of that. It's not necessarily part of the, sharing the burden and the workload, but it's part of the how do we get to hear those unheard voices? How do we get to engage with lived experience of service users, of service users, and so on and so forth, where the committee doesn't feel like it can get those voices through the more traditional consultation model. So there have been situations like that, but in terms of I suppose the work of the rapporteurs and subcommittees. I don't think it's, I see more in the Senate, especially over the past 2 terms, more the use of ad hoc committees. So establishing another committee in order to look at particular matters rather than subcommittees.
Thank you, Professor. And if I can go back to Professor Phillip for a moment, just around the training introduced in the Lords, has there been visible positive impact on how members then are able to engage with the subject?
It's one of those too early to say situations, and it's only just been, I think, rolled out, certainly the ones I've been involved with. So it's for members who are about to have the potential to be appointed to committees in terms of understanding how the committees operate. I mean, we start from the basis, I say, that members are appointed to a committee. They've normally got some knowledge of the subject area, so it's really how you harness that for the purpose of inquiries, putting questions, getting involved. And indeed, part of it is encouraging members to get involved in committees so we can draw upon their expertise. But it's fairly standard as well when committees are thinking of inquiries, would have a scoping session. So you bring in experts from outside to brief you on that subject area before the inquiry gets underway proper. You've already got at least some training or at least some grounding in the subject, which will complement your existing knowledge base. That's always very helpful. But we've not gone beyond what I've outlined in terms of sort of trying to train members in actually being committee members. How do you go about it in terms of questioning? But I think it's always important to bear that in mind rather than just members joining a committee and then thinking, what am I doing here? Am I going about it the right way?
Absolutely. That kind of brings me on to the next question, which is around, here in the Scottish Parliament, about a third of the members sit on multiple committees. What's your take on how effective members can be when their time is split across different policy areas, particularly when, it may be too very legislation heavy or detailed committees, and what are some ways around that?
Well, I think that last point is particularly important because you've identified the problem. If I remember looking at membership of the committee, you are a particularly good example of someone who's serving on more than one committee. So you do have a problem because the commitment, I mean, it's doable. I was thinking there was one period I served on 3 committees in the Lords at the same time. But that was exceptional simply because one was a joint committee looking at a bill. It is, I think, an issue. There's the burden on the individual member, but obviously then the consequence of the committees, because of the issue of size, which is particularly important in Holyrood, but the underdevolved bodies as well. And from a Westminster perspective, we sometimes fail to appreciate that because, of course, we're such large chambers. But when you've got the committees of the size you've got, as we've heard about the Senedd, it places a particular burden on the members with consequences to the committees, because you're then heavily dependent on the members actually attending. Therefore, the issue of resources, I think, becomes very important, because unless you're going to enlarge the membership of the legislature, how do you facilitate members of a committee being able to do their job? So I think there's a resource issue there. Do you provide members with additional resources? Now, in the Commons, chairs of committees are paid extra, but one way of dealing with it is actually provide resources to members of the committee in terms of research support. I mean, you could do it more collectively as well, a scrutiny unit, a research unit to service committees as well in terms of the information they may need. Another possibility is to give committees, for example, a research budget of their own, so they can commission independent research, which can be quite useful, because even if you're taking evidence, of course, the evidence is interested evidence from people with a particular point of view. So there are different ways you might seek to assist members individually and the committee as a whole with the resources available to members. But there is a challenge if you go beyond members serving on, say, more than 2 committees, because I think in the case of Holyrood, I think you're in an unusual position, because I think most members don't serve on more than 2 committees, which potentially is manageable, but it is a burden, and I think one has to address it, I think, through resources.
I
As a comment?
I was actually just going to ask her.
Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, Emma.
Yes, I mean, it won't be a surprise for anyone that the Senedd obviously is in a very particular particular place with relation to multiple membership in committees, and it has been a leitmotif in the whole existence of the Welsh Parliament, and I think a driving force behind calls for increasing the size of the Senedd. I suppose that one of the pluses, if you want, if you're a member in multiple committees, and I suppose I remember that I was making this point, about 15 years ago when I wrote an article, was that, being a member in more committees, you can help with kind of sharing the best practice around and bringing innovation from one committee into another committee. But the fact of the matter is that in the context of the Welsh Parliament, there's just too few people with too many portfolios. And I've interviewed one of the chairs, committee chairs that I interviewed at the time. He was on 4 committees. And whilst that is kind of an exception, but members do sit in 2 or 3 committees. Sometimes they sit in, 2 policy and legislation committees. So I think that the dangers there are quite well known. First, you can get very selective attention and engagement in committees. You might prioritize the work in just one committee and deprioritize the work in another committees and just become less engaged. This, in turn, if you have a committee of 6 members, for instance, as it happens in the Senedd policy and legislation committees, that can actually affect the quality of deliberation. And I suppose the other leitmotif in the Senedd has been that this particular deficit in terms of number of politicians able to serve in committees, that has been offset by increasing the resources and the setup of committee support. So in the Senedd, they operate through the committee support operates through integrated committee service teams, where you'd have not only the clerks and the second clerk, but you'd have like a researcher assigned to the committee, and you'd have a translator, and you'd have a legal advisor, and you have a public engagement official and a communication person that are assigned to that particular committee. So you have like a healthy team there driving and supporting the work of the committee. The problem with increasing the resources and support, administrative support, is that the danger there is that you can become a very officials-led committee or officials-led parliament, and that's I think something that no one wants. But yeah, the multiple membership in committees is a problem. It's not unique to the small legislatures. I have done some research in the Danish Parliament last year, and mind you, they have over 30 committees and 29 members in committees because of the rules about committee membership. And, some members that I spoke to sat in like 5 committees, but they did say, no, actually, I'm not going to these committee meetings, only the spokespersons are actually going. But that creates, even in a larger parliament, creates a problem of, smaller parties that have to fill committee seats are going to be unevenly sort of affected by this.
So I was actually going to bring you in because I wanted to ask about that problem of there being too few people. Because here, between a quarter and a third of MSPs are also in government. So if the Scottish Parliament pursued the same ratio that the Senedd is bringing in, we'd be looking at having 175 MSPs. So I was keen to get your views around what order we should look at that in. Should we be saying there are 129 members, so how big should committees be? Or do we say this is how big committees must be to be effective, so this is how many MSPs there should be?
Oh, that is a very, very big question. I suppose that in the question of the Welsh Parliament, it has always been accepted at the time that the Senedd was small. It's smaller sometimes than county councils or than local councils. And I suppose it was justified at the time because it didn't have a proper legislative function. It didn't have, I suppose, the portfolios that were devolved to Wales have gradually have been added on. I wouldn't be able to comment, for instance, in the question of the Scottish Parliament, because if there is an issue with multiple memberships and workload, and I think this needs to be probably part of a big review. In Wales, they have had this over and over and over again, from 2001, 2002, then, a number of commissions from the Richard Commission, they have all brought this. And you have seen how long it has taken, actually, to, although the political consensus exists silently and has existed for a long time in the Senedd, and this acceptance that there are too few members, it has been quite difficult, actually, to publicly endorse this and to create the political, movement to and the conditions to actually increase the size of the Senedd. But that would be, that requires a big review of the constitutional arrangements in Scotland and the appropriateness of, whether the Parliament is fit for purpose in the sense of size and powers and whatnot.
I suppose much of it could probably be borrowed from Wales in terms of rules like Cube Root. It's probably applicable in both legislatures. But I was keen to look a bit more into some of the resources that witnesses have mentioned around clerking and research. Obviously, the effectiveness of those requires MSPs both to use them and to understand how to use them. How would you suggest that we get around that?
I think it comes back to your opening question in training of the members themselves, because having experts available is important, but they should be on tap, not on top, which comes back, I say, to that point about training, so you know how to utilise them to get the information from them, but you're the ones then in control of that information and how you utilise it. So drawing on experience, including Westminster, I mean, a committee typically can have its own policy specialist or its own policy analyst. So someone who specialises in the area over and above the clerks who do all the administrative work. And then, apart from having your specialist appointments as policy analysts or whatever, bringing in particular experts for specific inquiries. So bringing in outside academic specialists on an ad hoc basis. I mean, the normal rule is you pay them on a per diem basis just for their particular expertise as part of that inquiry. So you can have a sort of your permanent base in terms of at least one or two policy analysts, but then complement that depending on the nature of the inquiry. So that can be extraordinarily useful as long as the members of the committee know how to make use of that expertise. So it's what I was coming back to earlier about sort of bringing in the resources, particularly when you have a small committee.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in terms of the House of Commons, there has been a significant increase in the support available to committees. I mean, an increase in the House of Commons library capacity, increase in the number of staff for sort of communication, social media, digital comms support for committees. There's been a lot of work done in terms of integrating the resources so that they operate, some of them across a number of committees, but that those resources are integrated and are sort of supporting each other. A lot of that driven because of Brexit and the need to increase capacity. So, ironically, despite what we've gone through Brexit and COVID, we've actually seen quite limited institutional change and procedural change, but we have seen a very significant level of change in terms of resource capacity. And I think though that support is institutionalised within each committee has its own media manager, it has its own sort of administrator, if you like, the person who does the logistics for the committee. You have the clerk who will be sort of in charge of drafting the report, and then you have the special advisors. Some committees have quite a number of them. They're very, some of them are very well resourced, better than others. I'm never quite sure how they manage that. Yeah, I mean, it is very noticeable that there has been quite a step change at Westminster.
And do you have a handle on how consistently and appropriately House of Commons library services are used by different members? Difficult
to say overall, but very, very highly used, very well used, and I think both in chamber and in committees, it is one of the go-to resources for members, if not the go-to resource, because it's trusted, it's impartial, very high quality, quick turnaround. Yeah. So very, very, very well used.
Yes, I mean, we call it the House of Commons Library. In fact, it's a research division. Well-resourced, experts in the area, as Ruth says, highly respected. What they say is taken as authoritative by the House and by people outside, by the media. So it's a very useful resource, both for members individually, because they can get briefings on whatever topic they want very quickly, and a resource for the House as well. I mean, complementing that as a scrutiny unit, which is good to have experts in particular areas available to service committees, which again is very useful because that's quite agile, because you can be dealing with different tasks across committees, complementing the staff that each committee has in terms of policy advice. But it's a tremendous resource, the House of Commons Library. The research unit, research part of the library, is a tremendous resource to have and benefits the institution enormously. I mean, the same with the Lord's Library. I mean, they're just both, because with two very separate institutions, but it's the same principle. And whenever surveys have done of members of resources in the two houses, you always know what's going to come top. It's the library.
So, members of the public often claim that they really like to see cross-party working, particularly in committees, and the ability for us to do that obviously depends very much on the culture. How do we foster that culture that allows and facilitates cross-party working?
Well, from the Lords, it's slightly different from the Commons, because it's, if you like, it's somewhat easier for us. There's far more of a bipartisan atmosphere in the Lords because we're not really in competition across party in the way that the Commons are. But at committee level, if you're looking at the Commons or elsewhere, an important thing is you've already got some of those elements in place where you've got committees where the membership exists for the whole of a parliament. So there's not a high turnover, you're not just ships passing in the night, you actually get to know one another. So I think that's rather important. Again, size is important, so that's where being relatively small may benefit, because you get to know one another as individuals, you're working together, you're taking evidence. I think its influence, select committee is very different from certainly the Commons dealing with public bill committees, different purposes. Select committees are undertaking inquiries to look at a particular topic, and the committees, of course, are in charge of their own agenda. They choose the subject matter. So to avoid sort of clashes, that can affect the choice of topic. You don't want to go for a topic that's clearly going to divide the committee and never going to agree on it. So looking for issues that are important but not necessarily overly partisan. So you can do a public good by inquiring into the topic, by choosing that topic rather than others where you're not going to reach agreement. So I think the nature of the way committees work, whether they're deliberating, taking evidence to produce reports, then I think that does foster that. And of course, you're taking evidence, you listen to the evidence. So I think that's quite helpful. So in terms of the way the committees operate, I think those features are important. There's then the wider issue of how the wider culture of the Parliament may affect that. I mean, certainly we get that at Westminster. There's a very notable difference between the Commons and the Lords in the way we behave, even in the level of dining. But other things, allocation of offices can make a difference nowadays. Every MP's got their own individual office, fairly isolated. House of Lords, no one's got an individual office. You share offices with others, so you get to know one another, and that fosters well, certainly information exchange, but although the offices are allocated on a party basis, but there's much more of a bipartisan atmosphere. But in terms of the committees, I think that having members appointed for the whole Parliament, you develop, and keeping committees relatively small actually is quite beneficial for that purpose.
To come in, Dana Stoker.
Yes. Thank you. I completely agree with Lord Norton in what he said. I wanted to add that in terms of fostering a culture of collaborative and I suppose a more kind of independent, away from party politics in committees, I think the chairs and the conveners are very important in fostering that culture. I think the whole process of goal setting and strategic planning and rallying up, against a particular set of goals and aspirations, that can also be a unifying experience for committees. I think, from the wider literature and from wider research, we know that committee cohesion, stability in membership leads to that as well. Very practical things such as, away days or off-site meetings where people have a chance to get to know each other on a personal level, away from scrutiny. I suppose that's also a way of doing that, and also what I've heard from the Welsh Parliament research that I did was this idea of creating that sense of collective endeavour in the committee, and actually, telling a compelling story about successes that the committees have. That is quite a unifying, experience for committee members. And as I was mentioning earlier, the difference between the sort of the high level goals and the sort of the more policy related goals. I have an example here from what people were saying in terms of what the aspirations, what change they want to see in committees, what they think a committee, an effective committee is. And for instance, in terms of the Legislation and Constitutional Affairs Committee in the Fifth Senate, it was, one of the aspirations was to be the guardian of, ensure the guardianship of the Constitution in Wales, to ensure that legislation stands the test of time, to ensure that that the committee learns and shares that learning with the government. And I think those are very uncontested goals and quite powerful. I think then when you move on to should justice be devolved to Wales, or policing, or this and that, that's when obviously party politics will come at play. But I think the ways of working are quite important, and these sort of more high level goals, and I suppose these are more kind of long term goals in terms of what committees work, what the committees are for and how they work. Those are essential. But the roles of committee chairs, from what I've heard from Wales, is very important. And the fact that in Wales they've introduced elected committee chairs ensured that they have a more powerful mandate to actually drive that independence and more independent approach in the committee work.
I'm just going to do that great convener thing and saying I'm just becoming slightly conscious of time, but please.
Just very quickly, because I think it's a fascinating contrast between Holyrood and Westminster, or between the House of Commons, in terms of the question you asked. Because in the House of Commons, you separate out scrutiny of legislation from the policy scrutiny, so select committees against public bill committees. So if you like, one's inquisitorial and one's adversarial. So they're split, whereas here they're combined. And I think it's an interesting question as to which actually is most conducive to the point you're making. So does a sort of consensual approach to policy scrutiny then carry over to legislative scrutiny rather than the other way around?
Well, it's fair to be saying, certainly in the House of Commons, the bill committees are whipped.
Yes. They're an extension of the chamber, essentially. Yes.
I was going to pick up because both of you mentioned kind of consensus and common goals as examples of cross-party working. Does good cross-party working require agreement?
I can say so. One of the committees that I sat in on, one member wanted a witness from one organisation to come, and another member said, well, hang on, if you're having them, then I'm having my favoured organisation. And in the end, nobody came. So nobody heard evidence on that subject at all. So I have a slight problem with reaching consensus even in select committees. And so to take two examples, when it was the 40th anniversary of select committees, Stephen Twigg, who was then the chair of the International Development Committee, he was showing off about how consensual the committee was. Well, the debate around 0.7% of GDP is massive, and to not have any divisions in that committee for a number of parliamentary sessions seems to me a little bit strange. We looked at the number of divisions in committees, and post the financial crash in 2007-2008, the Treasury Committee didn't have a division for years and years. And again, that seems a little bit strange that we have these massive events, debates within the public, and the select committees are either somehow sort of like fudging the differences or are not even going there. And I think there is a problem that if you are too obsessed with consensus, that you then don't deal with subjects that are important to the public. And of course there's going to be a disagreement, because these are massively important issues where there are fundamental disagreements about how to respond to them. So I do have a little bit of concern about the emphasis placed on consensus within the select committee system.
You have a comment? Then I'm going to gently move us on.
just to give the other sort of side of that, I mean, you think about political context. I mean, two examples in the last Parliament where committee consensus completely broke down. And the committees, therefore, were just, frankly, ignored to a very large extent. And that was the committee scrutinising the Department for exiting the EU, because it broke down not actually along party lines, but along Brexit lines, which was predominantly a party line, but not wholly. That had actually been it was a much bigger committee than normal in the Commons, because they needed to reflect the range of views on Brexit. But it didn't really function very well. It produced reports. And there was usually a minority report. You could see in the minutes all the sort of the divisions that there had been. And the other was the European Scrutiny Committee, which was doing very technical document-level scrutiny, and prior to Brexit had been sort of one of the committee, the unsung committees. It did important work, but it attracted no attention. It met mainly in private. It broke down largely on Brexit lines. The opposition ceased to attend in large part, the opposition parties. Now, that was a product of chairing. It was chaired by Sir Bill Cash. He had a particular position. He had a particular approach at that point to chairing the committee, which was not consensual, was not cooperative across party lines. And, it was a problem because important work was not being engaged with by the opposition parties. On the other hand, you could see why they sort of made the calculation that attending this committee was, frankly, a waste of their time. So those are just two examples of how it can work the other way.
And it comes back to my earlier point that it will affect the choice of topic for inquiry. So if you know you're not going to reach agreement, you probably avoid it. But you can, and you're not spoilt for choice when it comes to selecting topics, which can be extraordinarily important, but they're not the subject of divide between the parties. I've served on quite a lot of committees in the Lords. I've chaired committees. Never once, apart from a joint committee on the Draft House of Lords Reform Bill, have there ever been votes. And when I chaired committees, I've always taken the view any member of the public attending would not be able to work out the party of the members of the committee putting the questions. It's genuinely attempt to find out about the subject, to reach agreement, to come up with some constructive recommendations that will take us further forward. I mean, when I chaired the Constitution Committee, we did big inquiries into devolution, interinstitutional relationships in the United Kingdom, and we came to Holyrood as well as Cardiff Bay and Stormont, and reached agreement, produced a very big report. And aside, if it had been implemented by government, we'd be in a much better position than we are today. But it's by way of proceeding, by way of agreement. I chaired last year, we're debating the report tomorrow actually, on statutory inquiries, so public inquiries into tragedies. You can make quite a big difference there. So important topics, but they're not a subject of division between the members. So you can really add value by adopting this approach, and as is implicit in what's been said, the reports carry greater weight because they're agreed by all the members. So when the Brexit committee had no impact, it was because it's completely divided and wasn't taken seriously. But if all the members are agreed, signed up to it, and that's I think why the chair is so important in making sure there is agreement, you carry the members with you, you make sure as you go along that they're in agreement with the direction of travel, then you can come up with a report that can make quite a significant difference.
I'm gently going to move us along because I'm very conscious of time. Sue, can I come to you because I know that your
Thank
questions
you.
sort of build on what we've just
Yes,
been talking about, and I'll come back. Thank
And
you.
there has been a significant amount of overlap, and my section is on committee workload and time management. So with my eye on the clock and my old convener hat, if you don't mind, succinct responses from the panel, please. So I was wondering, I think the last thing the members of the public would want would be 175 MSPs, because they wonder what on earth we're doing in here anyway. But in terms of the current approach to committee subject coverage and how we're mirroring ministerial portfolios, I was wondering if you could perhaps comment on that, and are there perhaps other ways to organise committees, because we do have an awful lot of ministers in this government here, given the size, I suspect, of the thing. So maybe can I come to yourself first, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, so the question is, do you have to, formally, do you have to mirror the government departments or not? And then if not, can you reduce the size of the number of committees and the size of committees? So the right reforms in the House of Commons, two of the aims of that was to minimise numbers on committees, which they achieved broadly, and then reduce the number of committees, which they didn't achieve. So to what extent can you reduce the numbers and reduce the size of committees? One of the things that, because I didn't know very much about the Scottish Parliament, but I looked into it, and I was a little bit surprised about substitutes and how many there were, and whether they were needed and what quoracy was like and everything like that. I mean, because there's obviously the legislative function as well, it may be that substitutes are needed for that aspect, but for when it's a kind of inquiry like we're doing now, do you need substitutes to turn up who may not be that interested in it? And there are some, I had a quick look at the numbers, and there's some interesting gender dynamics to, so basically women are more likely to be substitutes, female MSPs are more likely to be substitutes and are overrepresented in that role. So there may be issues to do with workload that are gendered within the Parliament that you might want to look at.
That's interesting, because that's something we've not picked up on in terms of our gender audit things. So Diana, do you want to comment? Thanks.
Yeah, in terms of the remits, obviously in the Welsh Parliament, the committees do not mirror the ministerial portfolios, and they have quite broad remits. I think the advantage of that is that a minister can be, asked to appear in front of 2 or 3 committees scrutinising their portfolio. The downside to that is that maybe sometimes issues remain unpicked by any committee. So I don't think from my research I have strong evidence suggesting that one way is better than the other. I suppose the common knowledge and suggests that mirroring executive portfolios leads to better scrutiny. But I don't have more to add to that, apart from Welsh Parliament doesn't do that.
That's helpful. Professor Philip, briefly, if you don't mind.
Well, just to Westminster, we're spoiled because we've got 2 chambers and we're both very large. So the Commons has the members that enable select committees mirror government departments. So for every department there's a select committee. The Lords, we don't duplicate. The Commons, we seek to complement it. So we have committees that are cross-cutting, so they transcend departments and focus on... Yes. Yeah. So it's whether you could do a mix of the 2.
Oh, that's helpful. And we did hear earlier on about an internal document. Well, I think it was yourself, Dr. Fox, that says we need to ruthlessly prioritise to be effective. And there's also that balance of it being official-led. Yeah. I mean, as an ex-committee convener for education, we were very much led by the legislative agenda. And you can see that with some of the pressures we've got in the next coming weeks with the education bill. Now having to meet on Wednesday evenings and all sorts of things. So in terms of prioritisation, you mentioned an internal document that might help prioritise. Is there any other things that you think in tools and approaches that might be able to be adopted by committees to help balance that legislative work and the proactive work that I think is probably more of interest to the people on the outside in terms of some of the inquiries. Dr. Fox?
I would think about mixing up the type of work you do. So, by which I mean, yes, you in a sense, the legislative agenda has to be done. I suppose I would throw a question into the air as, does it have to be done on the exact timetable that the government is imposing on you?
Nice
I
question.
think that's an issue. We all know the political difficulties of that. But imagine a scenario in which a committee turned around and said, actually, we're not going to sit on Wednesday evenings to get this done by this date. You know, you're not, as I understand it, the Scottish Parliament doesn't operate in the way with sessional cut-off, annual cut-off in quite the way Westminster does, and therefore it ought to be possible to manage a legislative pipeline better. Therefore, government, if you haven't done it, maybe that's not a reason for us.
It's not our fault as a committee.
And if the committee sort of declined to do that once or twice, I mean, it would be politically difficult, but government might not be inclined to want to repeat the exercise. But anyway, that's a big political.
I enjoy that. That's quite helpful.
I would think about, for example, on the policy issues or the types. If you want to get sort of the public engagement or the higher profile, I would think about looking at some of the things that, for example, the New Zealand Parliament has started doing some new initiatives. It's introduced a scrutiny week, where it gives the government advance notice. Two to three times a year. This is very, very new at its embryonic stage, so we don't know quite how it will work, but it gives the government notice of 2 to 3 weeks in the year. In its case, it's linking it to the budget and the estimates because it's very concerned about its scrutiny of the executive on financial matters and the weaknesses of the system, and saying for that week, we are only going to sit in committee, there's no plenary, and ministers are expected to make themselves available. Committees require certain reports to be provided to them, and ministers are brought into question. And it's become quite a high-profile thing. So there's been quite a bit of media attention on it, and it's sort of developed, or they're trying to develop this sort of almost festival flavour around it to generate some attention. But it does mean that you, in terms of your own planning, have concentrated. It's a high level of effort over a short period of time, but it concentrates that and separates it from the legislative work, but gives you an opportunity to do something a bit different.
That's interesting. Does anyone else have any examples before I move on to... My next sort of question is on that theme as well, Dr. Fox, but it's not about perhaps engaging with the ministers in that manner. It's more about engagement with external stakeholders and how we can be much more effective in leveraging our relationships with those stakeholders in terms of driving more effective scrutiny and supporting the work of the committees to make us, because they are the external people like yourselves coming to give us are making us more effective in the supporting role that they can provide. So I was wondering if you've got any thoughts on that. Who would like to go first? Okay, Ruth.
Just two very quick things. One is in the House of Commons, there's very effective use of an outreach service, which is staff based in the regions who develop their own sort of community networks, if you like, and link into committee inquiries so that they can promote that through the civil society networks and encourage more people to give
they're
evidence.
Not based in West, they're based
they're based out in the regions. That means that more and more of the committees are able to get evidence that is not bluntly from witnesses like ourselves, the usual suspects, but to get, and particularly those inquiries like sort of on health or education or welfare, where you want, I hate the term, but it's well used, lived experience. And the second one would be the Swedish Riksdag does future days, 2 or 3 days in the year, when they bring in witnesses to look at big strategic questions, and they get both a mix of sort of expert witnesses but also the general public, and invite the general public to suggest inquiries.
I think we've kind of touched on that with our People's Panel on drug-related deaths, and I know I attended that. So have you got some comments there, Professor?
Well, only to reinforce that, in the Lords we have a Peers in Schools programme, so actually we go out to schools both online but in person as well. So we've done that quite extensively, isn't it? A lot of peers involved. in that, but at the institutional level, there's the issue of resources for making what you're doing accessible. The challenge is not so much the institution, because I mean parliaments generally are alert to the need to engage with people and to hear from them. It's actually getting the people to want to access that, to be involved. They're not always that interested. So that is a challenge, because however much you put out there, because of course there are different ways of doing it, as you do with your committees. You hold an inquiry, what's the first thing you do? You put out a public call for evidence, you emphasise that, you put material on online, but how many people actually get in touch other than organised interests who are already monitoring what's going on? So it's how you do that, because I remember when we did the first big inquiry on the Constitution Committee into devolution, we did a lot of work inviting members of the public to put in evidence, because we've got to get evidence from the great and the good. I think we heard from a member of the public in Wales, and that was about it. It was actually very good. But there is actually a challenge. You can
It's the fatigue from the public, isn't it, in terms of all the consultations that are going on from all different levels?
Yes, I mean, you were, I mean, when the Scottish Parliament was set up, you were very much ahead of the game, very good, in terms of petitions. Yeah. And this has really taken off at Westminster in terms of now online petitions to the House of Commons. Yeah. That's really engaging people. So that's certainly one way of getting, public engaged. I found it very useful from a parliamentary point of view, because you look at what some of the subjects are getting lots of signatures on, and you didn't realise that was really such a significant issue. And in the Commons, if a petition gets 100,000 signatures, it's eligible for debate in the House. And in practice, I think every petition that's done that has been debated. Indeed, lots of other petitions that fell short of 100,000 but important topics have been debated as well. So that's actually proving its worth in that sort of involvement.
I've got another... Diana, apologies, Diana.
No worries, just very quickly, I agree with all that's been said. In terms of, I think also sort of storytelling is important, and how the external communications from a committee in relation to an inquiry or to their work is managed in terms of multi-channel communication and so on and so forth to attract the attention. But I also think a point that I made in the report for the Welsh Parliament in 2021 was the importance of the data infrastructure that the Parliament presents. So the availability of data about the work of the Parliament and work of the committees for institutions like, higher education institutions and researchers, in order to be able to conduct proper, evaluations and research. Because I think that, once you have that availability of data and insights from the Parliament, a lot of people, like us in this panel, are going to be very interested in analysing and communicating that much broader than this particular forum. So I think that's also something to think about.
That's helpful. And I know we've heard about your examples about the researchers or the people in other parts of the country, but how do visits from the committees themselves and off-site evidence-taking impact the culture of committees and the relationships between committees, Parliament and public? Does anyone want to come in on that one first? No, not for Steve.
Challenge getting...
Thanks, Diana.
I've been on committees where we've gone out and taken evidence, but usually you're taking evidence from organised interest, not necessarily... There's no great public involvement other than the public being eligible to attend
it's just
and
like
follow the proceedings.
Stephen, before I come to Diana.
Yeah, just very... So one committee that I sat in on had an evidence session which was behind closed doors with people who had been affected by a particular issue which you wouldn't really want to be talking about in public. And that was run very differently. We weren't in a room like this. It was in Parliament, but it was in just like a relaxed atmosphere. There was pastries, etc., etc. So that was just done in a very different way, but was able to take evidence on a subject that you just wouldn't otherwise be able to get. You might be able to get people filling in a form, but you wouldn't be able to get that kind of direct experience or the interactions between the committee members and the people affected.
Yeah, we did something similar with the Promise, which is for care experience young people. We did a sort of informal meeting with those young people, and it was quite insightful. Diana, sorry, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I think from the Welsh Parliament perspective, what I've heard is that these off-site visits can be very powerful. Politicians love them. It really puts them in touch with lived experience of people. The question is there. How do you then acknowledge the value of these exercises? So it's important that then you translate this into the committee report and acknowledge, what people have heard, what have learned from that particular visit, because otherwise it remains just a PR exercise in the view of the people that you've engaged with.
And would you perhaps change it from being a PR exercise to something much more substantial and
I think if we look at the way, for instance, the Welsh Parliament committees have changed the way of reporting, we can see, I suppose, from the second or third term that there's sections in the report where they describe particular visits or particular interactions with the public. They acknowledge the value. They and they mention, just being quoted, just being mentioned in a report is actually, I suppose, making a difference. So I think, just acknowledge the value of those exercises for the inquiry and for the committee members.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Annie, can I come to you?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for taking the time today. My questions are on representation and diversity in committees. Obviously, other legislators are looking at diversity and representation as well. So, is there more of an argument to do incremental change, or should it be an immediate effect to allow it to be embedded? Because I think we were speaking, we are mainly a female committee. And as part of this as well, I was just going to ask, do you believe that having diversity in a committee with more female members or ethnic minority members makes the scrutiny better of witnesses?
I mean, so it certainly makes it different. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're doing a little bit of research at the moment looking at the Treasury Select Committee, which traditionally was very male-dominated, and then it had a female chair, and then it had a male chair with a female majority membership. And that certainly made a difference to what issues were being looked at. And we're doing another little bit of research, which hasn't, it has to be taken with a pinch of salt because it hasn't been published yet. But like female chairs, majority female membership makes a difference to the proportion of female witnesses being called. And there's work in the US that looks at ethnic minority legislators, and again that makes a difference to what topics are being focused on, even in areas where you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a gender focus or a race focus. I mean, I looked at your the breakdown of members in the Scottish Parliament, and like overall it seems to be like fine, like especially at convener and membership level, it seems to be broadly proportionate. Deputy conveners are women are underrepresented in deputy, and as I said, they're overrepresented in substitutes. But when you look at individual committees, it does seem to follow a pattern where men are overrepresented in policy areas which are perhaps more prestigious and which are seen as stereotypically masculine policy areas, which does mirror what goes on in other parliaments. But so I would prefer to go for a big bang kind of approach, because there's no point saying like a minimum of one woman on each committee if you get one woman on certain high-profile committees, more prestigious committees, and then a lot on the less prestigious committees. So yeah, it does make a difference both to who you talk to and then what gets talked about.
Don't know if anyone else has got anything.
Only to agree with your point about diversity of the value on committees, because as someone who's chaired committees, as well as being on them, conscious of the value of that. And in the Lords, in a way, you could say we've got the benefits. I mentioned earlier the method of appointment. You're appointed, so of course then you can take that into account in making sure it is a diverse membership. You're not dependent on election by members and choosing or stipulating to them who they should choose. So certainly the committees I've been on, certainly when I chaired the Constitution Committee when it's first set up, you know, the diversity. I was just thinking about who was on it, and quite diverse, and it benefits from that.
So there's one more thing I should have added. So we're looking at the most recent elections for Select Committee. In terms of like gender and ethnicity, the committees are doing like very well, but there is some concern about geographical representation. So like a lot of the Treasury Select Committee members are from London. I don't think there are any MPs outside of England on the Defence Select Committee, and that's not traditionally how it's been done. So there are sort of like, you know, you do have to balance different kinds of representation when we're talking about these issues.
And can I just come in with a very small supplementary? Just obviously when we're looking at diversity, do we think we're sometimes overburdening females to put them into more committees to get that representation in there, to get the gender representation? Or is there something that we can learn more about in the Scottish Parliament from other places so that we don't put pressure on females just to make up a gender balanced committee?
So I think like there's a reasonable proportion of women in the Scottish Parliament, and the issue is that the balance of them is not evenly spread across committees. So I think that's the issue, is about not having those imbalances where some committees are all male and all female. It's about getting like roughly 40% on each committee.
Westminster, it's not motivation, because if you've got women on committees, it's because they want to be. Because in the Commons they've stood for it, or in the Lords they've put their names forward and say, I'd like to be considered for this committee.
So slightly different, and up here we sort of get selected by our party. But anyway, I'll leave that there.
I think Diana had a comment.
No, it's just a very quick point that, you know, I think I agree. Like, I think we cannot divorce this question of representation and diversity in committees from the wider question of representation and diversity within the whole Parliament, and whether there are, you know, whether there's a sort of critical mass of women being represented. And, you know, I think, you know, the Scottish Parliament, yes, indeed, it is ahead of the game in terms of the gender-sensitive Parliament work that is currently happening. And I think it's just about the spread,
Sorry.
Briefly, it's also a product of, as we have increasingly, certainly at Westminster, fragmented party politics, and we have an increasing number of smaller parties, and a desire to sort of see representation of those as well on committees. The challenge is going to be how that is managed when you have potentially few or no women in those party groups, because that means then there's a greater onus on the women in the other parties to make up that that diversity balance, which would become a different pressure. In the House of Commons, on the Labour side, I mean, yes, they're elected within their party groups, but Labour did deploy a 50% requirement for women on committees. So to what extent any of them may have been dragooned, I don't know. But there was that. But we don't know much about the internal party electoral system for committees in the Commons. So there may be other factors at work in other parties as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
And certainly here in Scotland, with the De Hoyt principle, we're bounded by that party representation. Just before I hand over to Rona Mackay, incremental change to achieve this, or do we take a brave step and say this is what we're going to seek in gender balance and write it in? Is there evidence that incremental change is going to get there, or is there evidence that actually a solid decision by, whichever way it should go, by one chamber has seen effects that carry on. Stephen?
I mean, well, yeah. So, I mean, as I said, I would I would prefer to have like a change put into it, bringing in the rules, and then you have to abide by them, and that seems to me the way to go. Because otherwise, as I said, you might get imbalances across committees.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, does anyone else have any comments? Having put that big question there, I'm not going to close. No? All right. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I would be concerned purely on the question about how that matches up against party politics and the political representation of balance, because you could end up with a small number of women in one or two parties facing a greater burden. So before going for the big bang, I would want to do at the start of a parliament, when I knew the numbers, I would want to do quite a detailed analysis of actually this is what we should be aspiring to, but in practice, are we actually going to make your situation worse?
So is that something that a new session should address almost as their first question, maybe even, well, maybe after presiding officer, but before anything else? Because you then know,
the numbers,
template that you're sitting with.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'm probably going to be the last questioner, so I'm just going to sort of leave you with a few takeaways of what we've been discussing. So we've got 129 MSPs in this Parliament. I'm the Chief Whip of the party in government, and all of my members are on 2 or 3 committees, as we've talked about, and they're populated on the D'Hondt system, which the Convener has just referenced, which is the largest party, gets the most members. So I have 36 backbenchers to work with on 16 committees. Okay. I don't agree with my colleague Sue Webber. I think we do need more MSPs because our workload is increasing due to, thankfully, increased powers, etc. Nearly all of our committees have a full legislative agenda, so that leaves very little time for inquiries or scrutiny and things that we should be doing and we'd like to do, but we just simply don't have the time or people to do it. Gender balance, I am totally in favour on. I'm on the Gender Sensitive Advisory Panel. You can only work with the members that you have, and at the moment we've got quite a good gender balance in Parliament as a whole. It may not be like that next session, and the points we've just been talking about I think are really important right at the start of the next session. We need to look at that and see how. But the practicalities, I as Chief Whip, allocate places on committees, and I try where I can, but it's just not always possible to do it. The logistics of it just don't add up sometimes to do exactly what you would want to do. And just on the question of substitute members, Stephen, they are really necessary in this Parliament because we have such a big legislative workload, and stage 2s go through committee. So if someone's off ill, as you know, and obviously it happens in every workplace, we have to have somebody that can step in, to sort that out. So that's just a wee kind of, sort of synopsis of what we've been talking about. But my questions really relate to the role of conveners and the move to having elected conveners, how that's working in other legislatures, and the remuneration sort of aspects. So can I ask, probably Diana, first, what the impact of the introduction of elections and remuneration for committee chairs in the Senate has been, and how has it affected the role? What's the evaluation of that been?
So, yeah, thank you for the question. It's a really interesting one because there has not been a formal evaluation of the impact of the elected chairs. But from the research that, I conducted during my fellowship, and mind you, I interviewed only the chairs, I heard quite interesting narratives around the fact that people were elected gave committee chairs greater independence and authority. gave them a more powerful mandate to run the committee the way they wanted. One of the chairs, or the presiding officer, mentioned the importance of committee chairs being elected and being able to command the agenda in that way. And so, whilst there hasn't been a formal evaluation, the narratives from, and I looked at all the interviews a couple of days ago, were largely positive. The Chairs Forum who recommended that change, so it's embedded now. In terms of potential, so the future Senate committee has looked at the recently at the various thresholds that exist in the Senate standing orders for electing the chairs, and currently there's a threshold for requiring nomination to be seconded by a member of the same political group if the political group is more than 20 members. In their recommendations, actually, the future Senate committee recommends that the threshold of 20 members should be removed and all nominations should require a seconder, and not necessarily from the same political party. So, so we don't have a formal evaluation, but we have, different committees are picking up on this, and I think this move, albeit it's quite small, but it does speak to the fact that it might become embedded, and it is seen as leading to more independence from the political party groups. There's also talk that it's expected that the Chairs Forum will conduct a formal review of committees before the end of this term, but we don't know whether the elected conveners is going to be part of that. But from the evidence that I've seen, the perceptions within the Senate are largely positive.
And can I just ask when this was introduced, please?
It was introduced at the beginning at the 5th Senate in June 2016. 2016. And it came on the back of recommendation from the Chairs Forum at the end of the 4th Senate. And the context to that was that there have been maybe some examples of chairs, quite outspoken chairs, that have been removed from their role by their party groups, most notoriously maybe David Ellis-Thomas being removed by Leanne Wood at the time. Mm-hmm. So it's... Okay. Yeah. There's some political context there.
Sure, yeah. Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on elected conveners? And Ruth, I know that's been in place in Westminster for some time.
Yes, I mean, the Hansel Society, I think, was the first organisation to recommend paying chairs more. I have to say the objective that the Society had at the time was that you would develop a strand of senior backbenchers who would see the committee corridor as an alternative to ministerial office. That hasn't happened. Now, Stephen can tell you much more about how that interplay between ministerial office and the committee chairs has developed, but that has not been really achieved, in very few exceptions, but those exceptions would probably have happened anyway. What it has done, I think, is give status and profile to the role. But what we're seeing much more is that you go from the committee chair, you vault into ministerial office, you vault from ministerial office to a committee chair. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantage is always, well, the former minister knows where the bodies are buried. Mm-hmm. The former minister may also know which bodies they don't want to be uncovered. We tend to talk less about that. But I think Stephen probably can talk more extensively than I can.
Well, I mean, I haven't really got... what Ruth said is correct. I mean, the three things that I would add are introduction of elections at Westminster were good for female candidates for chairs. That was now there's not much of an issue here in Scotland as far as I can tell. Although again, there's a bit of a gender imbalance in terms of what committees women MSPs do chair. There's some evidence that the elections of chairs and members raised the media profile of committees, so it helped get the message out to the general public. And I mean, one thing that's come up in this discussion today, where I think an elected chair or convener would help, is if there is pressure to hurry up the legislative timetable. If you're elected, you may have more of a more heft to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I mean, in general, I think electing chairs, conveners strengthens Parliament in its relationship with the executive, and for me, that's a good thing.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to wrap up two sort of final questions here. Do elections and remuneration have to go together? You know, can you have elected conveners and you know, without, etc., etc.? And does it introduce more of a political dynamic if you have an elected convener? And you know, how does that work with the general running of the committee?
You don't have to have remuneration and election go hand in hand. Remuneration at Westminster came in before the election of chairs by some number of years. I'm trying to remember when remuneration started and failing, but they were separate, so you can do that. In terms of the politics, I mean, you do reach situations. So the approach to members and committee chairs is different for the electoral process. And there are still some committee chairs at Westminster that are not elected; they're appointed. Obviously, there's for those where it's held by one party, you are giving, by the nature of the electoral process, the main opposition party in particular, an outsized influence on the selection of who your party chair representative is going to be. And there is evidence, some evidence, that the opposition parties do like to think about who might be the more likely thorn in the side of the minister. And you can see that in sort of the electoral process and the way that the lobbying, if you like, goes on. But there are there's plenty of evidence also that even a select committee chair that has otherwise been seen as perhaps more supportive of the government traditionally, once they get that select committee chairmanship, they feel an obligation to the House. I mean, some of them talk in this way. Feel an obligation to the House as much as to my party. Now, it may be different on a committee in this Parliament precisely because you have the legislative obligations and you have the whipping, which we don't have at Westminster, so it's a different cultural context. But there certainly is, low politics and party politics perhaps with a small p going on.
I think that's just been realistic, to be honest. It couldn't really be any other way. I think, Diana, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think so. From the Welsh perspective, the committee chairs are indeed paid. As Ruth, there's I don't think there should be a straightforward assumption that that should involve extra payment. But I do think that in the context of very small legislatures with very heavy workload, that may make a difference. We're talking about the politics. The interviews that I have done with chairs, with committee chairs in Wales, I was surprised actually to notice that it was the Labour chairs that were very, very adamant, that they should be critical of government, that the committee, should promote this, independent and tough scrutiny culture, and the government shouldn't get away with it. So remember particularly some very strong views from one of the Labour committee chairs at the time, saying, like, I've decided to run to be a chair of the committee because I have seen time and time again that the work and the recommendations that we made in this committee that she had served in before were not implemented, and there wasn't any difference. And I take it upon myself now as a chair to really drive the scrutiny, to really drive the agenda. So I think, for some elected chairs, it's very important, the role, the profile, and even the remuneration.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to wrap up on that question?
Say you've got at Westminster, you've got the two houses, and therefore they're very different practices, which each are different from Holyrood. So, yeah, as Ruth has said, election of chairs, I think, has transformed culturally in terms of the role of the chair, how they're seen, more independent of government, more critical, higher profile, and you don't need to be remunerated. In the Lords, it's a different method. You are appointed by the House. So it's not just as here where the members are appointed, they choose who will chair. It's the House who makes the appointment of the chair, which gives you a different status because you've got that authority of being appointed by the House. So when you have the motion appointing members, it includes who will chair the committee. So that's a different method.
No, it's really interesting to hear of how everything operates. Yeah.
The only other factor I would perhaps throw into the mix, and it links to what I was saying earlier about sort of post-election situation. Depending upon turnover, the knowledge that the members may have about the pool of candidates that they are seeking election may actually be quite limited, and that's been certainly a challenge at Westminster. The sheer number of new MPs. The MPs that were seeking, including some new MPs seeking to become chairs of committees straight away. I mean, there is an inquiry going on now in the House of Commons by the Procedure Committee to look at that electoral process because the MPs became so frustrated and annoyed with the level of campaigning that went on by candidates for chairs. It was, it was immense. So that's another side of it, but also the knowledge of the candidates and actually, you may be getting chairs. There's nothing wrong with change and having somebody new, that can be good, but also somebody who loses out simply because they're not familiar to this massive new group of MPs also has its downsides. So there are, I just say that there are pros and cons.
Which would, of course, be different in this environment where it's much, much smaller. Thank you. That's kind of me. I just want to say, at the risk of sounding a bit creepy, on the question of backup to committees and resources. This is coming to the end of my second term here, but the backup from the clerks and the research team have been exemplary. I mean, we couldn't have asked for more. I mean, genuinely, I think everyone feels like that. We've got fantastic committee backup here. Yeah. Okay, thank you. That's me.
I certainly don't think that's creepy. Probably something that's every committee member is glad for. Can I thank the panel today for what's been a fascinating, interesting, and at times very in-depth. If there are any sort of subsequent thoughts that you have, please reach out to the clerks. Our inquiry will be going on. But can I just formally thank you all for your contribution and evidence today, and I'll bring the public part of this meeting to a close.